He loved her long before she ever knew, and he buried that love in boardrooms, calendars, and silence. Graham Whitmore had everything: wealth, power, a view from the top floor. But at 42, with a past full of broken promises and a heart walled off by ambition, he never expected to fall, especially not for his executive assistant. Evelyn Carter was never just a nameplate outside his door. She was the calm in his storm, the voice that steadied him when deals collapsed, the eyes he tried not to meet for too long. For 5 years, they walked a line. He hid behind professionalism. She hid behind duty. But one night in a quiet office, something shifted. Have you ever cared for someone so deeply, yet said nothing, because the cost of being seen felt too high? This is not just a love story. It's about timing, choices, and the courage to stop hiding. And if you've ever loved in silence, you'll find pieces of your own heart in theirs. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Every morning, long before the city wakes, she walks into that office, not because she has to, but because a part of her heart lives there. The streets of Charleston were still wrapped in sleep when Evelyn Carter pushed open the glass doors of Whitmore Holdings. It was 6:15 a.m., and the sun hadn't yet spilled over the Ashley River. The old bricks of the building still held the night's chill, and the only sound was the soft click of her modest heels against polished hardwood. She didn't rush. Evelyn never rushed. Her movements were deliberate, precise, graceful in a way that didn't call attention, but quietly commanded it. She liked the silence, the stillness before the city stirred. This was her hour before meetings, before phones started ringing, before the world turned too loud. The lobby was dimly lit, washed in soft gold from a single chandelier. She passed the marble reception desk, where no one would arrive for another hour, and rode the elevator alone to the top floor. As the doors opened with a gentle chime, the familiar scent of old pine wood and paper greeted her. A view of the river unfolded just beyond the large windows of the executive suite, calm, reflective, mirroring her mood. Her office, if it could be called that, sat just outside Graham Whitmore's. The sign on her door read, "Executive Assistant," but everyone in the company knew Evelyn Carter was far more than that. She placed her purse on the coat rack, shrugged off her light wool cardigan, and reached for the French press she kept in the corner cabinet. 1 scoop of dark roast, hot water at exactly 200 degrees, brewed for 4.5 minutes, no shortcuts. Graham liked it strong and simple. She had memorized that long ago. While the coffee steeped, she turned to his schedule checking times, reviewing memos, adjusting notes from a late-night update his legal team had sent just before midnight. Her desk was pristine. Everything had its place. Even the paper clips were aligned by size. At 6:40, the coffee was poured into a ceramic mug blue, with a hairline crack near the handle that Graham had never wanted to replace. She placed it on a small silver tray next to the day's briefing folder and quietly slid it onto the corner of his desk. She never knocked. He wouldn't be in yet. Evelyn liked that part of the day most, when everything was calm, when the world felt manageable, when her efforts had not yet been touched by anyone else's hands. By 7:05, the office began to hum to life. Elevator dings, footsteps, low voices. The staff on floor 7 always arrived early, and many paused at her desk with a polite smile or nod. They respected her not out of fear, but because she carried herself like someone who never had to raise her voice to be heard. And then, at 7:25, the rhythm shifted, the elevator opened, and Graham Whitmore stepped into the hall. He never arrived at the same minute each day, but Evelyn always knew when he was near. She could tell by the subtle hush that followed, the way conversations softened, the way energy shifted, just slightly. Graham was tall, lean, and impeccably dressed. His suits were never flashy, but tailored with a quiet elegance. He wore confidence like a second skin cool, composed, restrained. His hair, chestnut with a hint of gray at the temples, was always neatly combed, and his eyes, they were sharp, pale blue, and almost always unreadable. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he would say with a brief nod. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she would reply, eyes meeting his for just a second longer than necessary. It was a ritual, polished, predictable, and yet, somehow, charged. Evelyn had worked beside Graham for nearly 5 years. In that time, he had never once spoken out of turn, never blurred a line, never let slip more than a glimpse of emotion. He was, by every definition, a professional. But there were moments, small, quiet moments, when something in his expression softened, when his thank you seemed heavier than usual, when their eyes locked a beat too long. And Evelyn, she noticed every one. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when he was worried but didn't show it, the way he tapped his pen 3 times when he was processing bad news, the way his fingers curled slightly when he read something that moved him. She knew these things not because she studied him, though perhaps she did, but because her attention was never idle. It simply lived where he was. Still, she kept her distance, not just out of professionalism, but out of respect. Graham had his walls, thick, tall, deliberate, and she had hers. She had learned long ago that guarding your heart was easier than repairing it. At 8:00 a.m., Graham's door closed behind him. Inside, he would sip his coffee, flip through the morning briefing, and prepare for another day of running the company that bore his family's name. Outside, Evelyn sat quietly at her desk, typing notes into her laptop, eyes flickering now and then toward the door that separated them. Beneath the folders in her drawer, tucked between an old planner and a spare pair of reading glasses, sat a photo, small, slightly faded. It was taken during their first business trip to a candid shot of Graham looking out a hotel window, lost in thought. Someone from the events team had captured it and emailed it to her by mistake. She never deleted it. She told herself she kept it because it was a good picture, because it reminded her of the man behind the title. But deep down, she knew the truth. She kept it because it was the only version of him she could keep. And so, every day, Evelyn showed up, punctual, flawless, unshakable. But behind all her quiet grace, Evelyn had a secret. He built an empire from his father's dreams, but somewhere along the way, he forgot how to dream for himself. The Whitmore name had always meant something in Charleston. In the post-war years, when the city was still recovering from storms, both literal and economic, Harold Whitmore started a humble real estate business with nothing but a ledger book and a loyal handshake. He built slowly, block by block, home by home, until Whitmore Holdings became a name people trusted. Solid, steady, Southern, respectable. Graham Whitmore had grown up in the quiet shadow of that legacy. His father believed in discipline, and his mother believed in silence. Together, they raised a son who understood early on that emotions were to be managed like spreadsheets, precisely, discreetly, and preferably alone. By 32, Graham had taken over the company. By 35, he had doubled its value. He had the corner office, the jet-black car with tinted windows, the calendar that never had room for personal time. And, for a while, that was enough. He'd been engaged once. Her name was Caroline Smart, poised, just the kind of woman the world expected a man like Graham to marry. But expectations and connection weren't the same thing. Over time, their evenings became quieter, then shorter, until they mostly lived on opposite ends of the same silence. She left one rainy Tuesday, the same day he closed the firm's biggest coastal land deal. He didn't chase her. He barely paused. The contract went through. The headlines celebrated. And Graham went back to work. He told himself he was fine. He told himself she was never truly what he needed. But sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, when the house was too quiet and the wind stirred the branches outside his bedroom window, he would lie awake and wonder what it meant that he hadn't missed her, but had missed something. At 42, Graham lived in the same colonial home he grew up in, a sprawling white house near the edge of town, wrapped in ivy and memory. The furniture was tasteful, the art original, the silence complete. He cooked for one, ate standing by the window, drank black coffee late into the night, and reread the same books he'd loved in college. He rarely invited anyone over. The room stayed clean, untouched. He lived, in many ways, like a man waiting for the next meeting. And maybe that's all he thought life would be, agendas and acquisitions. Until Evelyn Carter entered his office. She wasn't flashy, didn't talk too much, never pushed past the boundaries he instinctively set, but she was sharp, impeccably organized. And most dangerously of all, she noticed things. The way she always had his coffee waiting before he even asked, the way she adjusted his schedule before conflicts even arose, the way she could sense the mood of a boardroom before he even walked in. She read situations like he read spreadsheets, effortlessly, accurately, quietly. At first, he thought it was just professional admiration. Then, one evening, after a particularly tense investor call, she left a single note on his desk before heading home. Tomorrow will be better. You always find a way. No name, no flourish. Just that. And Graham had sat in his chair for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the handwriting. He had never needed anyone. Not really. But in moments like that, he realized that being needed and being seen were two entirely different things. And Evelyn Carter saw him. Of course, he never let on. He kept their interactions formal, predictable. A nod. A thank you, Miss Carter. A glance that never lingered. But behind the calm surface, something restless had begun to stir. He'd think about her voice sometimes, soft but confident, or the way she gently tucked her hair behind her ear when she was reading reports, or how she never laughed loudly but always with her whole face. He told himself it was just proximity, familiarity, routine, but he knew better. Still, he did nothing, because Graham Whitmore didn't allow himself to want things he couldn't control. And real love was never part of the spreadsheet. Then came the day he forgot her birthday, or rather, he never remembered it in the first place. That morning had been a blur: calls from New York, last-minute investor meetings, a broken Zoom link that delayed everything. He hadn't looked up until well past 7:45, by which point Evelyn had already delivered his coffee, placed the meeting folders on his desk, and gone back to typing quietly. He didn't notice anything different. But she had come in 20 minutes earlier than usual that day, wearing a navy blue blouse he'd never seen her in before, and inside her tote bag was a small bakery box, tied with a thin white ribbon. She'd never get the chance to hand it to him. By 11:00 a.m., he was on back-to-back calls. By noon, she slipped the box into her drawer and quietly went out for lunch. That night, after everyone had left. Evelyn sat at her desk in the dim light, staring at the unopened box. Then, with a soft sigh, she untied the ribbon and placed the cupcake gently into the staff fridge. With no name, no note. She didn't want it anymore. And Graham none the wiser drove home that night with a stack of signed papers and an untouched heart. He poured himself a glass of scotch, looked out across the river from his second-floor study, and told himself once again that he didn't need anyone. That solitude was safety. That love was for people with less to lose. But as he stood there in the dark, one hand on the cool glass, something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was already losing something far more important than he knew. And while the city slept, both hearts stayed wide awake, waiting for something neither dared to name. Sometimes love doesn't speak in words. It speaks in glances, in silences, too heavy to ignore. The Atlanta trip had been scheduled for weeks. It was one of the biggest events of the year, Regional Summit for Urban Revitalization, hosted by developers, mayors, and policy leaders from across the South. Whitmore Holdings had been invited as a keynote sponsor, and Graham was slated to deliver the opening remarks. He hadn't originally planned to bring Evelyn, but with last-minute changes to the itinerary and pressure from press interviews, she had become essential his anchor in the storm of logistics and egos. When she stepped into the town car waiting at the Charleston office that Tuesday morning, she carried her leather binder, her laptop bag, and the kind of quiet composure that always made things feel more manageable. The flight was only a little over an hour, but it felt longer. They sat beside each other in business class, aisle and window, with no one between them. The cabin buzzed softly with announcements and the hum of tired travelers. They didn't speak much. Graham read through his speech, occasionally underlining a phrase. Evelyn typed out last-minute edits to his talking points, adjusting for updates she'd picked up from the planning committee that morning. The air between them was calm, but charged, like something just beneath the surface was waiting to rise. She stole a glance when he leaned his head back for a moment, eyes closed. His jaw was tight. A rare crease had formed between his brows. It was strange how familiar his face had become, not just the outer edges of it, but the way it changed when he was tired, or quietly pleased, or wrestling with a decision no one else knew about. And then he opened his eyes and looked straight at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. It was only a moment, a breath's worth of silence. But in that moment, Evelyn felt the weight of something neither of them had dared name. She turned her gaze back to the screen in front of her, heart beating a little faster. The plane touched down under gray Atlanta skies. Rain had swept through earlier, leaving the tarmac slick and reflective. By the time they reached the hotel, an elegant high-rise overlooking Piedmont Park, the event was already buzzing with movement. They checked in at separate counters, he with a professional nod, she with a quiet thank you. Their rooms were on the same floor, but 2 doors apart. That evening, after the welcome reception and back-to-back briefings, Evelyn returned to her room, slipped off her heels, and sat by the window with a glass of iced tea. The city outside flickered to life headlights, distant music, the soft glow of rooftop patios scattered across the skyline. She didn't expect to see Graham again that night, but around 9:15 she stepped out to refill her ice bucket and passed by the lounge area just off the executive floor. The lighting was low. Almost no one was there. And that's when she saw him. He was sitting alone on one of the leather sofas, a glass of scotch in one hand, and his phone resting on the table in front of him. He wasn't scrolling, wasn't working, just sitting, staring down at something in his other hand, a small, worn jewelry box. She froze, just out of his line of sight. With a slow movement, Graham opened the box and took out a ring. Simple, gold, classic. He held it between his fingers, turning it slightly under the light. There was something raw in his expression. Not pain exactly, not longing, more like resignation, like he'd made peace with something, but the echo of it still clung to him. Evelyn had never seen him like that, not at board meetings, not in crisis, not even in the quiet moments between. Here was a man stripped of his armor. He placed the ring back into the box, shut it, and sat very still for a long moment before slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Evelyn quietly turned and walked away. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The image wouldn't leave her, the way he looked at that ring, not like a man who couldn't let go, but like one who didn't know where to put the grief he'd been carrying too long. She hadn't known the whole story. No one did. But in that glance, in that private moment he didn't know she'd seen, she understood something fundamental. He hadn't forgotten the past. But maybe he didn't want to live in it anymore. And beneath the suit, the title, the impeccable restraint, Graham Whitmore was just a man, one who had loved, lost, and kept going without ever really arriving anywhere new. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep much. She lay with the curtains half open, the city lights painting gold lines across the carpet. And her mind kept circling back, not just to what she saw, but to what she felt. She'd always admired him, always respected him. But somewhere along the way, admiration had grown roots. She wasn't foolish enough to name it yet, not aloud, but the truth hummed quietly beneath the surface. And in that moment, Evelyn knew she wasn't just working for a man. She was falling for one. It started with a breaking news alert. Then came the calls, the panic, the storm, and a choice. Thursday morning began like any other. Evelyn arrived before sunrise, her usual quiet steps echoing softly through the marble corridors of Whitmore Holdings headquarters. The river beyond the windows shimmered in a faint silver haze, and Charleston still lay under a sleepy fog. She brewed Graham's coffee just right, 2 teaspoons, not 3, and placed it on the corner of his desk, as always. Then her phone buzzed. It was a news app. The headline froze her in place. Whitmore Holdings faces lawsuit over zoning violations in Crescent Bay project. She clicked, scanned, read again, and felt her stomach sink. A neighborhood council had filed an injunction against one of the company's most anticipated real estate developments, a waterfront restoration meant to bring housing and retail space to a once-abandoned dockyard. The article claimed the project had pushed past historic zoning limits. There were photos, quotes, speculation. Within 20 minutes, the story had been picked up by 2 more outlets. By the time Graham walked into the office at 7:10, Evelyn was already on the phone with legal. He didn't ask questions at first. He simply read her face. And that was enough. "Call the VPs," he said quietly. "All of them. Emergency meeting in 30. The boardroom was buzzing by 8:00. Legal briefs flew across the table. Crisis PR teams chimed in remotely from New York and D.C. The air was thick with tension, strategy, and the undercurrent of fear something rare in a building that prided itself on calm under pressure. Graham sat at the head, commanding the room with his usual clarity. But Evelyn noticed his fingers tapping ever so slightly against the polished wood surface. A small tell, invisible to anyone else, but not to her. She moved like a second heartbeat, distributing statements, rescheduling media interviews, answering calls, relaying internal memos. She knew every number to dial before he asked, every document to bring before he finished the sentence. By mid-afternoon, the company's stock had dipped 9%, and the sky outside had darkened into a brooding gray, mirroring the atmosphere within. When most of the team left around 7 p.m. to regroup from home, Graham stayed behind. Evelyn didn't ask whether she should go. She didn't need to. She simply kept working. The storm outside broke around 8:30. Sheets of rain slammed against the tall glass windows as lightning cracked above the Cooper River. The world beyond the building faded into a blur of water and wind. Inside, the only sounds were the soft taps of keyboards and the hum of the backup generator. Just after 10 hours, the power flickered, then failed. Only emergency lights and laptop screens remained, casting a warm, almost intimate glow across the main floor. Graham stood at the window for a long while, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a report Evelyn had printed earlier. Thunder rolled in the distance. His silhouette looked almost sculpted in the soft light solid, but somehow tired. She sat nearby, finishing a press release draft, her fingers stiff from typing. A faint headache had formed behind her eyes, but she ignored it. This was what she did, what she was good at. Somewhere in the middle of paragraph 4. She felt his presence beside her. He didn't speak right away, just leaned slightly over her shoulder, eyes scanning the screen. His breath was calm, steady, but close enough to stir a strand of hair near her temple. "You wrote this?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "It's just a draft. Needs your tone, your approval. It's perfect," he said, his voice softer now. "You always know exactly what to say." She turned slightly to look at him, but he didn't meet her gaze. He was still reading the screen. And then, without pretense, without warning, he spoke again. Evelyn. Just her name, just one word. But it was enough. Not Miss Carter, not the polished title that kept them safely apart. Evelyn. Spoken like it meant something, like she meant something. The syllables landed like a stone dropped gently into still water rippling through her, settling somewhere too deep to name. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only light was from her laptop, casting an amber halo across her face and his. The storm outside was forgotten. She didn't correct him, didn't say, "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," didn't pretend she hadn't noticed. Instead, she let the silence hold, let his voice settle around her like warmth, because maybe tonight, beneath thunder and fluorescent flickers, beneath company titles and shareholder reports, they weren't CEO and assistant. They were just Graham and Evelyn, two people holding the weight of the same storm. Two people who'd, despite every reason not to, kept showing up for each other. That night, they worked until nearly 1 a.m, and when she finally gathered her things, hair slightly damp from the open window, shoes in one hand, laptop in the other, he walked her to the elevator. They didn't speak much, but in the soft hum of the closing doors, she caught him watching her one last time. Not like a boss, not like a man guarding his distance, but like someone finally realizing just how close she'd always been. And for the first time in 5 years, she didn't correct him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't proper. But it was real. By 1:30 the Charleston storm had started to settle. The rain no longer pounded the windows with urgency. It had softened. Now just a murmur against the glass, like the world outside was catching its breath after holding it too long. Inside, Whitmore Holdings. The emergency lights hummed faintly. The city had given up on this part of the night, but inside the glass-paneled office overlooking the river, two people had not. Evelyn Carter sat barefoot in the staff lounge area, legs folded neatly beneath her on the worn leather chair. A blanket from her desk wrapped around her shoulders. Her heels sat discarded by the door. A half-finished turkey sandwich rested on a paper plate in her lap. Across from her, Graham Whitmore leaned back in his chair, looking more like a man than a CEO for once. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his tie draped across the arm of the chair like it had surrendered to gravity. His jaw held a trace of stubble more than usual. He hadn't shaved in 2 days. The weariness in his face wasn't just from the lawsuit or the media storm. It was something deeper. "This," he said after taking a bite, "may be the worst sandwich I've ever eaten." Evelyn grinned, then feigned offense. "I'll have you know I studied culinary improvisation under fluorescent lighting," he chuckled low. "Tired, but real Remind me never to cross you in the break room. It was a silly moment, a throwaway exchange, but it hung there, suspended between them like it mattered, because it did. She took a slow breath and looked out the window. The bridge lights across the river shimmered through streaks of rain, casting a glow that made the wet pavement look almost silver. "You ever think about leaving all this?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft, the question not entirely directed at him. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. Then he said, "More times than I care to admit." Evelyn glanced at him, studying his profile, the sharpness of his cheekbones, the way his brow was furrowed even in rest. "I almost moved to Boston 4 years ago," she offered. His gaze turned to her, quiet but attentive. "I had an offer from a tech firm there. Strategy team. More money, a better title, the whole fancy package, downtown apartment, travel perks. Why didn't you take it?" "My sister," she said simply. "Claire. She was diagnosed with lupus that same week. She was 24. I couldn't leave her." "Not then." There was no bitterness in her tone, just fact, steady and sure, like Evelyn always was. "She's doing better now," she added, pulling the blanket a little tighter. "Most days are good. She teaches kids art classes, bright ones, full of color." Graham watched her closely. "You gave up a lot for her." Evelyn shrugged, eyes still on the window. "Sometimes. You don't think of it as giving up. It's just doing what matters." A pause. Then, almost as if confessing a secret she still doesn't know, "I turned that job down." Graham leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You ever regret it?" She smiled faintly. "Not once. But some nights," her voice caught slightly, "some nights I do wonder who I might have been." They sat in that shared wonder for a while. The office was quiet, humming gently with the sounds of late-night machines and distant thunder. Outside, the streetlights flickered back to life, one by one. Graham looked down at his hands. Then, in a voice more vulnerable than Evelyn had ever heard from him, he said, "I was engaged once." She turned her gaze slowly toward him. "Julia," he said. "We were together for 2 years. Got engaged because, well, everything made sense. Our families got along. We had plans. It all lined up. What happened, I kept waiting to feel something more." His jaw tightened. "I thought it would show up closer to the wedding. That one moment where I'd look at her and just know. But that moment never came." He exhaled, long and low. She deserved someone who looked at her and didn't see a schedule or a quarterly report. She deserved a man fully present. I couldn't give her that. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of her paper plate. She wanted to say something, to comfort, to validate, but the moment didn't need words. And then she reached out. Her hand found his, not forcefully, not dramatically. It rested there gently, like it had been meant to settle there all along. A quiet act, a whispered yes. Graham didn't pull away. He didn't look startled. He looked still. For a long, silent moment, their hands remained joined, resting between 2 half-eaten sandwiches and a conversation that had wandered into unfamiliar territory. Neither of them spoke. There was no, "What does this mean?" No declarations, no explanations. Just 2 people, tired of pretending they weren't alone. Evelyn could feel the warmth of his hand, the calluses along his fingers, the steady pulse beneath his skin. It was more intimate than any kiss could have been, more revealing than any confession. Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it sneaks in through the smallest crack, a glance, a brush of fingers, a moment like this. Outside, The storm had passed, but inside, something new had begun, and in that silence, everything they had been holding back began to speak. Sometimes, the smallest gesture becomes the biggest rumor. Charleston was just waking when Evelyn Carter stepped out into the pale light of dawn. The streets still smelled of rain. The storm from the night before had left puddles along the cobbled sidewalks, and the sky carried the soft pink hues of a day not yet defined. She and Graham walked in silence, not side by side, but near enough. He carried her laptop bag without asking. She didn't argue. Their shoulders nearly brushed as they exited the office building through the back entrance, a private habit after long nights. They didn't touch, didn't linger. Just two professionals leaving after a late crisis. But someone saw. It started with a glance, then a whisper. By Tuesday, it had bloomed into something heavier, an unspoken weight that Evelyn could feel pressing against her back every time she walked past a colleague's desk. The mailroom assistant, who usually smiled when she brought morning memos, looked up with eyebrows raised just a little too long. The receptionist, once warm and chatty, grew measured. Even Camille from Legal Hair lunch partner on Friday seemed suddenly more curious than kind. Evelyn knew the signs. She'd worked in enough offices, been in enough rooms where women's reputations could be unraveled by nothing more than a misunderstood glance or the wrong timing of a door closing. No one said anything directly. They never did. But coffee cups stopped being offered. Voices lowered when she entered a room. And the worst part Graham didn't seem to notice. He carried on with the same calm professionalism, navigating board meetings and crisis communications with laser focus. He was cordial, composed, perhaps even more careful now, avoiding eye contact longer than necessary, calling her Miss Carter with clipped precision. Evelyn understood. He was protecting her, or at least he thought he was. But protection that feels like distance doesn't always feel like care. Wednesday afternoon, Evelyn was called into a closed-door meeting with Marla Crane from Human Resources and James Ellison from Corporate Affairs. The tone was polite, the phrasing immaculate. We're reviewing team alignment, cross-department dynamics, considering growth opportunities in other markets, but the subtext was unmistakable. She wasn't just Evelyn Carter, the brilliant executive assistant who had saved half a dozen major deals in silence. She was now Evelyn Carter, the woman people were starting to talk about, and that changed everything. When the meeting ended, she walked out with her chin high and her shoulders square. She didn't cry, not at the office, not yet. But she did sit at her desk for a long time, staring at a blank email titled Request for Relocation, Nashville Office. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. The Nashville branch was growing. They needed operations leads. It was far enough away, quiet enough. She could start fresh, work hard, hide in plain sight. It made sense. It always did, for women like her. Women who gave everything to a company, and who could lose it all over something as simple as being seen walking next to a man at dawn. A man who happened to be her boss. She stayed late again that night, not out of necessity, but to avoid the ride home. The silence of her apartment felt heavier these days. By 8:00 p.m., the building had emptied. Her inbox was sorted, her reports filed. The draft relocation request sat printed on her desk, unsigned. She poured herself a cup of stale break room coffee and leaned by the window, watching the city bleed into darkness. She didn't hear the knock at first. It was gentle, not commanding, like the sound of someone unsure of his right to interrupt her solitude. She turned, startled. Graham stood in the doorway, one hand in his pocket, the other holding two takeout containers, "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said simply. His voice wasn't the clipped, careful one he'd been using for the past few days. It was softer, familiar, like the version of him she'd met in the glow of laptop screens and stormy windows just nights before. Evelyn didn't speak. Her eyes fell briefly to the document on her desk face down, but too near. Graham followed her gaze, walked in, closed the door. "What is that?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then picked it up and handed it to him. He read it once, slowly, then looked at her, really looked at her. "You were going to leave." "I was trying to protect what's left of my reputation," she replied, her voice calm but low. "There are meetings happening behind closed doors. People are assuming things. And no one's going to question your character, Graham, but mine." She gave a small laugh. "Well, women don't get that luxury, do we?" He didn't argue. He couldn't. She walked past him, picked up the coffee cup she hadn't finished, then set it down again. Her hands were shaking. "For 5 years, I've done this job with quiet excellence. I've been invisible when I needed to be, indispensable when it mattered. I didn't ask for this attention. I didn't change. The way people see me did." Graham took a step closer, the form still in his hand. "You don't have to go." "And if I stay?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Do we keep pretending? Do I keep sitting outside your office while people whisper and wait for me to fail?" Silence. He set the paper down on her desk. Not ripped, not signed, just placed. "I don't want you to go," he said, his voice lower now. "But if you do, I want it to be because you chose it, not because of whispers." Evelyn's eyes softened. Her breath caught, and for the first time in days, she saw not just her boss, but the man who, for all his power and pride, had no idea how to keep from losing her. But before she could turn it in, Graham knocked on her office door. He had built an empire with strategy, but for the first time he was led by his heart. The morning after the unsigned transfer request, Evelyn arrived at Whitmore Holdings earlier than usual. She didn't stop for coffee, didn't pause to admire the quiet shimmer of the river beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her heels echoed softly in the still corridor, but inside her everything thundered. The conversation with Graham the night before had left her unsettled and strangely steady, like a storm that had passed but left behind a changed shoreline. She didn't know what today would bring, but she had decided she wouldn't run. By mid-morning, a confidential board session had been called. 12 people in a glass-paneled room, one long mahogany table, 2 names on the agenda: Graham Whitmore, Evelyn Carter. The whispers had turned into structure now formal, lined up and dressed in business attire. Evelyn entered the boardroom with her head high. She wore navy, clean lines, a pearl pin her grandmother had left her. It reminded her who she was before titles or rumors. Graham was already there, standing near the head of the table. He looked tired, but grounded. A man who had already decided what he would say, no matter the cost. "Let's begin," said Marcus Langford, the senior board member, clearing his throat and adjusting his glasses. Graham didn't sit. He placed a folder on the table, calm and precise. "In the past 5 years," he began, "this company has expanded into 12 new markets, increased our annual net gain by 47%, and doubled our philanthropic initiatives without sacrificing ethics or quality." He looked around the table, meeting each gaze with quiet steel. "Many of those victories were not because of me. They were because of Evelyn Carter." A murmur stirred. Someone shifted in their seat. "I am recommending she be promoted to Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately." The room went still. Graham opened the folder, revealing page after page charts, financial reports, internal audits, performance reviews. These aren't gestures, they're numbers, data, results. She has led quietly for years. What I'm asking for now is simply recognition, a pause, a heartbeat. I trust her more than I trust anyone in this building, including myself. Evelyn felt her pulse thudding in her ears. She kept her gaze low, her hands folded neatly on her lap. But her breath came deeper now, rooted, steady. "I'm sorry, Graham," said board member Judith Reinhardt, leaning forward with her fingers laced. "But this feels reactive. It looks like damage control after a perceived entanglement." Graham's jaw flexed. "And what exactly is your concern?" he asked, voice even. "That this decision is not entirely objective." Graham nodded slowly, picked up one of the reports. "This is a 5-year review of Evelyn's crisis management contributions. Compare it with our last 3 COOs. She outperforms them in every metric, and she did it all from outside the executive tier." Judith opened her mouth, but he raised a hand, measured, not dismissive. "If your concern is perception, I understand, but I won't let perception overshadow performance." Another board member chimed in, Leon Cross. "Always one for control. And what about the rumors, Graham? You two clearly have history. It wasn't a question." Evelyn felt the words like a cold draft, but she didn't flinch. She looked up now, straight at Leon, her voice calm and steady. "I have never used personal proximity for professional gain. If anything, I've spent 5 years proving myself twice as hard to avoid that exact assumption." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her truth was heavier than any accusation. Still, Leon shook his head. Even soap pointing her now sends a message, and that's when Graham stepped in. The silence before he spoke was deafening. "If her presence threatens your definition of fairness," he began, his voice low but unwavering, "then perhaps it's not fairness you're defending, but your own fear." No one moved. He didn't speak with fire. He spoke like a man who had peeled every layer of doubt from his soul and found only one truth worth protecting. "I've built this company brick by brick from my father's garage floor. And if the cost of integrity is letting go of someone this vital, then maybe this company isn't what I believed it to be." He turned thankfully to Evelyn, and the whole room felt the shift. This wasn't a boss speaking to an assistant. This was a leader choosing his equal. "I don't want a COO who's convenient," he said. "I want one who's exceptional." And then he sat. Evelyn's throat tightened, not from surprise, but from the weight of being seen, truly seen, not for whispers or assumptions, but for the years of excellence no one had clapped for. Marcus Langford looked around. "The board will now vote," he said, adjusting his glasses once more. 12 people, 1 decision. The room grew still. Papers shuffled. Pens clicked. And in that moment, everything hung in silence. One by one, hands were raised, and a woman finally got what she always deserved. The air in the boardroom felt heavier than usual, thick with silence, expectation, and the weight of unspoken truths. 12 people sat around the table, papers in hand, expressions unreadable. Outside, the Charleston sun poured through the tall windows, casting long lines of light across the dark wood floor. Evelyn sat still, her hands folded in her lap. On the surface, she looked composed, regal, almost. But beneath the calm, her heart thudded like a drum. She wasn't waiting for validation. Not anymore. She was waiting for honesty, for people to look past the gossip and into the years of work she had poured into this place. Marcus Langford cleared his throat, tapping his pen once on the table. "Well, proceed with the vote now," he said. "A simple majority will decide the appointment." There was no discussion, no more arguments, just choices, the kind that revealed who people really were. He turned to his left. Judith. There was a pause, a long one. Judith's eyes moved from Graham to Evelyn, then down to the folder before her. She had been skeptical, loudly so, but now she raised her hand. Yes, it was quiet, but it landed like thunder. Next came Leonard. He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window, then raised his hand halfway. Yes, based on merit. 2 votes. Evelyn sat straighter. One by one, they continued, some quickly, some after painful seconds of silence. 7, 8, 9. Each yes felt less like victory and more like release, like a truth finally allowed to stretch its limbs and stand up straight. Then came Elaine Peterson, a veteran in the company. Quiet, stern, but fair. She leaned forward. "I've worked with Evelyn for 6 years, she said, her voice low but firm. She's never asked for attention, never asked for credit, but she's earned both." She raised her hand. Yes. 10, just 2 more. The second to last board member, a man named Craig, who rarely spoke, simply nodded. Yes. Then all eyes turned to Marcus. He closed his eyes for a beat, let out a long breath, and raised his hand. Yes. The room exhaled, not with celebration, but with a kind of sacred respect. It had been done. Cleanly. Officially. Evelyn Carter was now Chief Operating Officer of Whitmore Holdings. Not because of favoritism, not because of romance, because she was the right person for the job. As the board adjourned, chairs scraped softly across the floor. Papers shuffled. Voices murmured. But Graham stayed seated. So did Evelyn. They didn't speak until the room had cleared and the door clicked shut behind the last board member. The sun had shifted now, casting softer light across the floor. Graham looked at her. Not like a CEO, not like a man defending a choice, but like someone seeing something fragile that had somehow survived the fire. "I didn't know how it would go," he said, voice rough with the remnants of adrenaline and emotion. "I did," Evelyn replied softly. He raised an eyebrow. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated," she said. "Eventually, you get used to surprising people." Graham let out a short breath, almost a laugh. But there was awe behind it. There always had been. She stood then, smoothing her skirt, walking toward the wide window. She paused there, the city glinting beyond the glass, her reflection faintly visible over the skyline. "I didn't want the title," she said quietly. He stood too now, keeping a gentle distance. "You earned it. I know." She turned to face him. Her voice didn't tremble. Not anymore. "I didn't need a title, Graham. I needed fairness. I needed to know I wasn't going to be diminished for caring too much, working too hard, or for what people assumed they saw." He nodded. The words hit deeper than she knew. "But," she added, and something in her voice shifted warmer now, more vulnerable. "There's something else I want. Something I've never said aloud." Graham stepped closer. She met his eyes, steady and sure. "I need you." His breath caught. Not as a boss, not even as a partner in business. She smiled, soft, tired, radiant, as a man, as the person who sat with me in a dark office and remembered what it meant to feel something real. Graham reached for her hand. And this time, she didn't pull away. The moment was quiet. No speeches, no dramatic music, just 2 people finally seen, finally heard standing together in the soft afternoon light, After everything, after 5 years of distance and decorum, after rumors, promotions, storms, and secrets, they were simply together. He squeezed her hand gently. "Evelyn," he said, her name a whisper more than a word. She looked up. "This changes everything." She nodded. "It already has. Some rings are bought, some are inherited, but some are simply waited for." 6 months passed like a quiet tide. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady. Evelyn Carter, now officially the chief operating officer of Whitmore Holdings, had led one of the company's most ambitious projects to date, the Magnolia District Revitalization Initiative, a historic preservation turned modern marvel. What was once a stretch of forgotten warehouses along the river now pulsed with life art studios, small businesses, affordable housing, and community gardens. It wasn't just a real estate win. It was human. It was Evelyn. The press praised her vision. Investors noted her discipline. Internally, people no longer whispered. They watched, they respected, they learned. Even Judith from the board started sending her handwritten notes after meetings. And through it all, Graham stayed close, but never too close. They built something slow, deliberate. No grand declarations, no sudden changes in routine, just long walks after work, thoughtful silences, inside jokes shared over spreadsheets. No one questioned their bond anymore, because now it spoke for itself. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the water, casting golden streaks across the windows of the riverfront restaurant. Evelyn sat across from Graham at a quiet corner table, tucked behind a curtain of ivy. A jazz trio played softly near the patio, and the scent of grilled peaches and rosemary lingered in the air. She wore a simple navy dress. He wore a dark gray jacket, no tie. They had come here before years ago for work dinners, but tonight wasn't about work. Graham watched her laugh over a story about her sister's latest art project, a mural involving recycled soda cans and glow-in-the-dark paint. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, like he was still learning her, even after all this time. After dessert arrived caramel tart. Split between them, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small velvet box on the table. Not dramatically, not on one knee. Just gently, as if he were offering a memory. Evelyn looked at it. Her heart didn't race. It settled. He opened the box. Inside was a ring. No diamonds, no sparkle. Just a thin gold band simple, smooth, timeless. She looked at him, her brows furrowed not from fear, but from wonder. "Am not proposing," he said softly, almost with a smile. At least, not in the traditional sense. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. "I bought this ring once," he continued, "for someone I thought I was supposed to love." He paused, "But I never gave it to her, because something inside me knew it wasn't right." Evelyn's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall yet. Graham picked up the ring between his fingers, held it in the light. "I kept it in a drawer for years. Not out of hope, out of habit, maybe. Out of wondering if I'd ever feel something that didn't need to be explained or justified." He looked at her, then really looked. "And with you, I never had to force anything. Not even this." The world outside kept spinning boats past. Glasses clinked, jazz played. But in that moment, it all faded. All she could see was him. He slid the ring toward her. "It's not a promise of a date or a party," he said. "It's just a mark of what already is. That you are the one I choose every day, not for appearances, not for convenience, but because I've never respected anyone more." The tears came then, not because of the ring, but because the time had passed, and he had stayed, because he hadn't rushed this moment, He had waited until her worth could never be questioned by anyone, including herself. Evelyn reached out, took the ring, and held it in her palm. It felt warm, light, familiar. She whispered, "I don't need a title." He nodded. She added, "I don't need a wedding date." Another nod. She looked up into his eyes, calm. "Sure, unwavering. I just need the truth. And you?" It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. Graham reached across the table, and this time he didn't hesitate. He took her hand slowly, reverently, and slipped the ring onto her finger. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the world felt still, like even the river paused to watch. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. They walked hand in hand along the dock outside the restaurant, the wooden boards soft beneath their feet, the air cool with the promise of evening. Evelyn looked down at the band now circling her finger. She didn't think about who it was once meant for. She thought about how long it had waited, how long he had waited, and how, somehow, so had she. They didn't need a wedding date, just a lifetime starting now. She used to stay behind the scenes. Now, she stands at the front telling her story. Charleston bloomed in spring, wisteria curled along iron railings. Church bells chimed faintly in the distance. The river, calm and sure, glistened beneath the morning sun. And in the heart of the city, a crowd gathered under a white canvas tent beside a stretch of newly built community spaces, the final phase of the Magnolia District revitalization, now complete. Children giggled near the garden paths. Small business owners stood proudly in front of their new storefronts. Cameras lined the press section, and Evelyn Carter stood at the podium. She wore slate gray simple, elegant, no loud jewelry, no title badge, just a quiet confidence that didn't ask for permission. The plaque behind her read, "In honor of those who built in silence, so others could speak." A year ago, she might be stood off stage, clipboard in hand, making sure someone else's microphone worked. Today, they were all waiting for her. She adjusted the mic, took a breath, and looked out over the crowd. And there, in the very last Rono VIP badge, no spotlight, stood Graham. He wore a navy suit and an expression she had learned to read like her own. Steady, proud, present. He didn't need to be center stage. He never did. Because when love is built on respect, it doesn't compete for space. It holds it. Evelyn cleared her throat. Her voice came strong, but soft. "I used to believe that the best work happened in the background," she began. "That if you were quiet enough, reliable enough, invisible enough, you'd earn your place." A few heads nodded in the audience, mostly women, mostly older, women who had spent years behind desks, behind scenes, behind men. "I was wrong," Evelyn continued, "not about the value of hard work, but about who deserves to be seen." She paused. Her hand lightly brushed the edge of the podium where, tucked inside, was a small, worn nameplate. Evelyn Carter, executive assistant. She kept it with her, always. It wasn't a relic. It was a reminder. "I keep this," she said, lifting it for the crowd to see, "because it's where I began. It's where many of us begin. But it's not where we're meant to stay, unless we choose it." Scattered applause rose. She waited until it faded. This project, she gestured around, is not about buildings or branding. It's about reclaiming stories. About giving voices to people who've been told, in ways loud and quiet, that they don't belong at the table. Her gaze swept toward the community volunteers, toward the maintenance crew in the back, toward the single mothers holding toddlers, toward the ones who knew what it meant to be seen too late or not at all. "I was never just a secretary," she said, her voice a little steadier now. "I was a strategist, a builder, a sister, a woman who loved a company enough to fight for its better self. And I stand here not because someone gave me a seat. She smiled gently, but because, eventually, I decided to take one. The crowd rose in standing ovation, not just for the words, but for the years of quiet integrity that now had a voice. After the speech, Evelyn stepped aside, letting her team lead the next phase of the event. She didn't rush to interviews or cameras. She let others shine. She always had. Graham found her near the garden paths, beside a row of newly planted lemon trees, her idea. "You left them speechless," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes warm with memory. "You never doubted I could do it," she replied. "Not once." They stood together in the filtered sunlight, their hands brushed, not possessively, just naturally. He glanced down. "You kept the old nameplate." "I kept all of it," she said. "The hard days, the silence, the closed doors. It made today what it is." Graham nodded. "Do you remember what I said to you that night, a year ago, after the board vote?" She tilted her head. "You said this changes everything." He smiled. "And you were right," she added. "But not in the way I thought. It wasn't the title. It was finally believing I deserved the room." Graham gently took her hand, no longer tentative. They had crossed every line that once held them apart. Now, they simply walked together. No need to define it. No need to explain. Just two people, equal, whole, and chosen. Later that afternoon, Evelyn returned to her office. It hadn't changed much. Still faced the river. Still had the same mug from 5 years ago. Still smelled faintly of jasmine from the candle Claire had given her. She placed the nameplate gently in her drawer, not to hide it, but to protect it. It would always be part of her. A letter sat on her desk, handwritten, from Camille, the former lunch partner who once kept her distance. It read, "I watched you from the sidelines. Evelyn, I was afraid of what it would cost to step forward, but you showed us that the cost is worth it. Thank you for not leaving quietly." Evelyn smiled, a deep, full smile, the kind that only comes after surviving not just storms, but silence. She looked once more toward the window, where the city pulsed with possibility, and in that stillness, she let the past settle, not behind her, but beneath her, as foundation. Not every woman gets to tell her story, but today, she had. And it mattered, not because of applause, not because of headlines, but because someone else might be sitting behind a desk now, wondering if it's possible, and they'd remember her. She was never just a secretary. She was the woman who loved in silence until one night changed everything. In a world that often values volume over virtue, Evelyn's story reminds us of the quiet power of patience, dignity, and staying true to who we are. For years, she worked in silence, not because she lacked strength, but because she believed in doing the right thing, even when no one noticed. And Graham, guarded by regret and driven by duty, had to learn that love, to be real, must be brave. Together, their journey teaches us this: respect is the foundation of love. Timing matters, and sometimes the strongest relationships are not the loudest, but the ones that survive without applause. If you've ever loved quietly, waited patiently, or stood in the background hoping someone might see you, know this: your story matters. Your presence matters. And it is never too late to be seen, respected, and loved for exactly who you are. Let Evelyn and Graham remind us that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a name softly spoken and a hand that finally reaches back. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. If Evelyn and Graham's story touched your heart, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who believes in second chances, and if you'd love to hear more gentle, heartfelt stories like this, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world. Until next time, take care, and never stop believing in the power of quiet love.